system responsible for some stereotype movements like chewing, right? Rhythmic movements or stereotypic movements like chewing that are repetitive movements. Not voluntary. Voluntary movements are those that we can decide about them and we can control every moment of the control. Every moment of the movement consciously, right? But chewing actually is started by voluntary movement or by decision, but after that it goes automatically. But it's very similar to walking. So you first decide about walking, and after that, when you start, everything goes automatically, right? Here we have also the same. I mean, chewing is started deliberately, but after that, it goes automatically at a subconscious level. You don't think about every part of the movement, right? So we have also some centers responsible for eye movements. So you know that we have several nuclei in the brainstem responsible for eye movement, like oculomotor, abducens, trochlea. So all of them are responsible for eye movement. And we have also, for example, superior colliculus and some tracts responsible for eye movements, right? Yeah, very good. But today, we won't talk about these. We want to talk about postural movements. Posture means the position of the whole body, right? So let's see these movements. So you know that in the reticular formation, we have two sets of nuclei. Pontine reticular nuclei, medullary reticular nuclei. They are the origin of two tracts, right? One is the medullary reticular spinal tract. دست شما درد نکنه متشکرم. So, can you hear me now? Okay. One is medullary reticular spinal tract. The other one is pontine reticular spinal tract. So medullary one descends on the lateral funiculus. Pontine descends in the ventral funiculus. In the ventral funiculus, we have also two other tracts: lateral vestibulospinal, medial vestibulospinal. These originate in the vestibular nuclei between the medulla and the pons, right? So we have seen four different tracts here. Let's see the functions one by one. Pontine reticulospinal tract originates from the pontine nuclei, right? Specifically, oral and caudal pontine reticular nuclei. So let's see the features that neurons have here. First one is that neurons here are highly active. So they are spontaneously active. They generate action potential all the time. Okay? So they can generate action potential without any input. But besides that, we have also some inputs to the pontine reticulospinal tract. They originate from the vestibular nuclei, deep cerebellar nuclei, and ascending sensory fibers in the spinal cord. So you should imagine everything in your mind anatomically. The nuclei are located in the pons, right? They are always active. They also receive excitatory inputs from vestibular nuclei, cerebellum, and the spinal cord, right? But they descend in the anterior column and they send excitatory signals to the anti-gravity muscles. What are these muscles? Muscles around the vertebral column, like muscles of the neck, muscles of the trunk, and also extensor muscles of the limbs, proximal part, right? Arm and legs. Extensor muscles only. So we call them anti-gravity muscles. So from the pontine nuclei, neurons come down, they reach the ventral horn of the spinal cord. In the ventral horn, they connect to alpha motor neurons. Alpha motor neurons innervate anti-gravity muscles. And this connection is excitatory. When the nuclei are activated, muscle contracts, right? So, medullary reticulospinal tract originates from the nuclei in the medulla, reticular nuclei. But these neurons receive input from higher level centers, like from the cortex, motor cortex, right? From the basal ganglia, and also from the red nucleus, right? So, corticospinal tract, spinal tract, and other pathways, like from the basal ganglia, generate inputs to the medullary reticular nuclei. Then, fibers from these nuclei descend in the spinal cord, in the lateral column, lateral folliculus, right? They inhibit anti-gravity muscles. So the signals from here are inhibitory. So anti-gravity muscles contract by the action of the pontine reticulospinal tract and relax by the action of medullary reticulospinal tract, right? So, lateral vestibulospinal tract. You know that we have 4 different vestibular nuclei, right? The main one is the lateral one. So from the lateral vestibular nuclei, we have lateral vestibulospinal tract. Okay? It also descends in the ventral funiculus. It receives input from the semicircular canals in the internal ear. You know that semicircular canals are very sensitive to any change in the balance or in the equilibrium. Yeah, head position. So, for example, when you're turning so fast during the driving, semicircular canals are activated. They send excitatory signals to the lateral vestibulospinal tract. So this pathway is activated. It also receives inhibitory inputs from Purkinje cells of the anterior vermis. We will see this in the next session. Purkinje cells are inhibitory cells. Each part of the cerebellum has a deep nucleus except for the folliculo-nodulus lobe, right? For the folliculo-nodular lobe, we don't have cerebellar nucleus. Output neurons go to the vestibular nuclei. Vestibular nuclei receive direct input from the Purkinje cells of the cerebellum lobe, right? So they descend ipsilaterally, the same side, in the ventral funiculus. They end on alpha and gamma motor neurons. They excite alpha motor neurons to extensor muscles, again, anti-gravity muscles, right? So they cause contraction of anti-gravity muscles, inhibition of flexors. So lateral vestibulospinal tract contracts extensor muscles and cause relaxation in flexor muscles, right? So they are important for posture and balance. You should remember these 2 words. Posture, the whole body position, right? And balance. But pontine reticulospinal and medullary reticulospinal tract are mainly involved in postural movements, right? So these are specifically important for balance. Whenever we have any change in position that causes being out of balance, this system is activated and causes changes in the position that opposes the deviation from the balance, okay? So, medial vestibulospinal tract. It originates in the medial vestibular nucleus and inferior vestibular nucleus. And it also receives input from the semicircular canals. It descends bilaterally. It ends on the medial group of interneurons. Do you remember from our previous session, I told you that in the anterior horn of the spinal cord, we have some neurons located laterally, important for contraction of the distal part of the body, right? Some other neurons are located medially. They are important for contraction of the proximal part of the body and also axial muscles. So these pathways all terminate on medial group of neurons. That's why they are important for contraction of extensors and axial musculature. We call them collectively anti-gravity muscles, right? So this pathway only descends to cervical segments of the spinal cord. So they are important for movements of the head only, this one. So lateral vestibulospinal tract descent in the whole spinal cord causes contraction of anti-gravity muscles, right? But this one only descends to the cervical segments. So this pathway is only important for head movements, right? Whenever we have out of balance position, right? So tectospinal tract originates from the superior colliculus. It's located in the midbrain. It has 3 different sensory motor map. So it receives some signals from the visual system, some signals from the auditory or hearing system, some other signals from the somatosensory system. So there are 3 maps overlaid. Okay? Sensory, somatosensory, visual, and auditory. So when we feel a touch in our body, we suddenly look at the position of the touch, okay? So it causes eye movement and head movement toward the stimulation point. Or if we see something moving there, we automatically change our look toward that object, right? And if we hear something, we suddenly look at the point, okay? So all of these are made by the superior colliculus. So head movement and eye movement toward some visual, auditory, or somatosensory stimulations. Right? So tectospinal tract is important for this. Then, now let's talk about the decerebrate animals. So imagine that we have a cat, okay, that has a damage at the level of the midbrain. Okay? So you should imagine in your mind the brain, cortex, subcortical area, diencephalon, okay? Then we have midbrain, pons, medulla, spinal cord, right? Damage is in the midbrain, I told you. So at the level of the red nucleus, right? So what happens to the pontine reticular nuclei and medullary reticular nuclei? Are they damaged now? No or yes? So the connection of the brain is like this. Everything starts from the brain and goes toward the peripheral part of the body, muscles, right? For the motor system, it's like this. So the origin is the cortex, the effector is the muscle. For the sensory system, everything is reversed. Everything starts from the body and ends in the brain. So now you have a cut in the midbrain. And now we are talking about the motor system. So this means the cortex and subcortical areas do not have any connections with the body, right? But medulla and pons are connected to the body. So what about the pontine reticular nuclei and medullary reticular nuclei? So they are working, right? There is no damage here. But what about the inputs? I told you that the pontine reticular nuclei receive inputs from the pontine from the cerebellum. It's below the damage, right? Cerebellum. No, not medullary. Pontine. Yeah. It receives information from the cerebellum, which is below the damage, so it's working, right? It receives inputs from the vestibular nuclei. It is also working. and spinal sensory neurons. So pontine reticular nuclei have all of their inputs. So the whole system is working now. But what about the medullary one? The medullary reticular nuclei themselves are below the cut or below the damage. So they are working now. What about the inputs? The inputs are coming from the cortex, so it's lost. Basal ganglia, it's lost. Red nucleus, it's in the midbrain, it's lost. Right? So all of the inputs to the medullary reticular nuclei. So what happens to their function? Pontine nuclei are working, medullary nuclei are not working. Pontine nuclei contract the muscle, medullary nuclei cannot cause relaxation. What happens in the anti-gravity muscles? We call this rigidity. Yeah. So the muscles become very tight, rigid, stiff, hard. Okay? What are the symptoms? Hypertonia, so the tone of the muscle increases. Stretch reflex increases, so we have hyperreflexia. But extensor muscles are rigid, so flexor muscles cannot oppose the movements of the extensors. So flexion reflex is suppressed. Above the damage is working itself, but it's not connected to the body. Right? So the cortex is working. So the patient may, for example, may be able to, for example, see something, because for visual system, everything is in the brain, right? So the higher part is working, but there is another problem that cancels all of this, you know? I didn't want to talk about this, but now you asked me and I mentioned. So we have some centers in the brainstem responsible for wakefulness, for arousal. So we are awake because our brainstem keeps the cortex awake. So when there is damage in the midbrain, these neurons are lost, so consciousness is lost. The patient will go to the coma. Okay? If this happens in a patient. So you can see the same in a patient here. So in this patient, decerebrate posture, we have a damage at the level of the pons. I mean, the higher levels of the pons. So pontine reticular nuclei are intact. Medullary reticular nuclei are intact. Medullary one loses all of its inputs. Pontine nuclei can have their inputs. So everything is in favor of excitation. Right? Inhibition of the muscles is lost. So the result is rigidity in extensor muscles. So the arms are extended, right? The legs are extended, feet are extended, all of that. So you can see extension in all body parts, right? But if there is damage at the level of the upper midbrain, when the red nucleus is intact, okay, what happens? We should have the same position here, but there is one difference here, and that's the flexion of the arms, right? Flexion happens because of the hyperexcitability of the red nucleus. Red nucleus is in the midbrain. In this patient, it's walking, and usually the cortex inhibits the red nucleus. Now we have a damage at a higher level. The cortical inhibitory fibers are lost here. So the red nucleus is disinhibited. So it's hyperactive. So it can cause flexion of the arm. Remember from our previous sessions that we had two pathways in the lateral system: corticospinal tract, rubrospinal tract, right? So they are related to the lateral system. I mean, when they come down through the spinal cord, they end on the lateral neurons in the ventral horn. that are responsible for flexors, mainly in the distal part of the body, distal part of the arm and legs, right? So corticospinal tract and rubrospinal tract usually have flexor bias. I mean, they cause flexion. But all of other pathways we mentioned today have extensor bias, right? So, and another thing about the rubrospinal tract is that in humans, they only descend to the cervical and higher thoracic levels. So they are involved in contraction of arm, not for the leg, right? So that's why we have flexion in the arm, but extension in the legs. So extension in the leg is being caused by pontine reticulospinal tract, but flexion in the arm is caused by rubrospinal tract. Got it? Yes.
Pontine reticular spinal tract. Sensor or motor?
Which one?
Pontine reticular spinal tract.
It's a motor system. It's actually descending in the spinal cord. It originates from the pons and go down through the spinal cord. So it's a motor system. Okay. So there are also some other pathways in the spinal cord that are important for movement, but they don't cause direct movement. They don't cause, overt movement. But they can facilitate or inhibit the function of other pathways. For example, we have some neurons originating from the locus ceruleus, right? Or from ray nuclei that descend in the spinal cord and release some neurotransmitters like norepinephrine or serotonin. Okay? These neurotransmitters doesn't cause directly any movements. Okay? But they may facilitate activation of the alpha motor neurons by other pathways. So remember that some of these neurons are originating from the locus ceruleus, others are coming down from the ray nuclei. Okay, now let's talk about the motor cortex. There are several areas in the brain that are responsible for voluntary movement, purposeful movements, movements that we can decide about them. Okay? In humans, these movements usually involve arms and hands, and also face for the lip area for speaking. Okay? So there is a clear distinction between the voluntary movements of humans and all other animals. So animals and humans are the same in walking movements and in eating, but they are clearly different in voluntary movements of the hands. Okay? So we can say that based on this, we should have a huge area in the brain responsible for movements of the hand. And you can see this in the motor cortex. Okay, so let's see the motor cortex. Everything is located anterior to the central fissure. So we have the central fissure here, the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, right? Precentral gyrus, which is Brodmann area 4. Then we have Brodmann area 6 here. The Brodmann area 4 is called primary motor cortex, or M1. We have Brodmann area 6 here, which has two areas, premotor area in the ventral part and supplementary motor area, which is located superiorly, right? We have also other areas that are important for movement, like it's not shown here, but we have some of them. For example, in the cingulate cortex, cingulate cortex, it's located in the medial side of the brain, right? So we have cingulate motor area also. But usually it's not mentioned in the general books, okay? So we have also somatic areas here, just posterior to the central fissure. They are also important for movements. Yeah, there are sensory systems, but without this part, motor functions cannot be done precisely. Okay? So for voluntary movement, we need also this one. somatosensory cortex, and also Broadman area 5 and 7, somatosensory associational areas, right? So, in the primary motor cortex, we have a map of the body. You can see that the mouth is represented here, face, hand, arm, trunk, and between the hemispheres, we have some areas for legs and feet, right? What does it mean? It means that when we move our hand or our arm, we are using this area of the brain to control the muscles. So this area is responsible for movement of the hands. But the connection here is contralateral. So this one is the left hemisphere. So this area of the brain is responsible for movements in the right hand. Right? When we, for example, talk, we use our face muscles for talking. So face area of the cortex is activated. Okay? So now let's see the human homunculus responsible for movements of our body parts. So this is only one hemisphere of the brain. So we have cut the cerebellum coronally through the Broadman area 4, the primary motor cortex. So you can see that the between hemisphere, we have foot and leg. Then at the highest level, at the superior level, we have trunk, right? Then we have some areas responsible for movements of the shoulder, elbow, wrist, hand, fingers, face, and tongue. Right? So you can see that a very large area of the cortex is devoted for movements of the face. And also a very large area of the cortex was devoted for movements of the fingers. So this means that movements in the face and in hands have the highest level of preciseness, and they are very important for our movements. So that's why we have a very large area in the cortex, right?
Which cortex controls the movement of the main cortex?
So primary motor cortex.
Brain?
Yeah.
And also the limb
It is also involved. It is also involved. So we will see that today. Okay? So the primary motor cortex has the most detailed map of the body. So you can see that for every part of the body, we have some areas in the primary motor cortex, right? Another thing is that if you activate some neurons here, we will see movements in a group of muscles usually, not only in a single muscle. What does it mean? Neurons in the cortex are involved in movements, in generation of a specific movement, not contraction of a specific muscle. For example, you can imagine having this movement. Okay? So for this movement, there are several joints involved: elbow, shoulder, wrist, fingers, and a lot of muscles are activated. Right? So a lot of muscles are involved. So we have some neurons in the cortex for performing this movement. Right? So when these neurons are activated, this movement is done. We don't have neurons for contraction of a specific muscle in the hand, another neuron for contraction of another muscle, and still another neuron for contraction of other muscles. Okay? One neuron may activate all of these muscles. Yeah, for a specific function, exactly, for a specific motor movement. Right? So, again, excitation of a single neuron in the M1 usually excites a specific movement. This movement may involve several muscles. So, one neuron may contract several muscles, but for specific movements, right? Okay, this picture is not from your book, it's from another source, but it's very important. So, this image shows the precentral gyrus, so Broadman area 4. Here we have Broadman area 6, premotor area, okay? And this is only the part of the cortex responsible for movements of the arm. So it's arm motor area, right? So let's go back to this slide here. In the arm motor area here, we have a specific area for shoulder, another one for elbow, another one for wrist, hands, for every fingers, right? But now let's see here. This is the whole arm motor area. These blue dots are dots that can cause a contraction in fingers. So if you stimulate this part of the brain only, it may cause a movement in a finger. So you can see that there are several points responsible for movements of the fingers, and all of them are scattered through the whole arm motor area. So some finger neurons are here, others are here, here. So all over the arm motor area, we have some neurons responsible for movements of the fingers. Now let's see these orange dots. They are responsible for wrist movement. So again, you can see that they are scattered all over the arm motor area. And for elbow, they are here, and here. And shoulder again. I mean, for movement of shoulder, we don't have a very specific area in the cortex like this. Neurons for shoulder are scattered here through here. So all over the arm motor area. And also for finger movements, they are found in the whole arm motor area. Right? Did you get this point? Good. So now let's get back to the primary motor cortex. If you stimulate neurons here, they cause contraction of a group of muscles, so they may cause a movement. With mild stimulation, this movement will be simple. Like this one or this one. This is a very simple movement. It only involves one joint, the wrist. Right? But in this example, for example, eating movement, it's a very complex movement, no more than two. Shoulder is involved, right? Elbow, wrist, fingers. Yeah, mastication muscle actually are controlled by the face area, okay? So let's only consider this movement, right? So several muscles and several joints are activated. So we call this complex movement, right? So for having isolated movement or simple movement, a mild stimulation in the primary motor cortex is enough. But for having a complex movement, we need a strong stimulation. So mild stimulation causes discrete movement, strong stimulation causes coordinated movements of multiple muscle groups, which is called complex movement, right? So any movement has several features: speed, force, direction. So all of these are controlled by the primary motor cortex. Primary motor cortex determines muscle force, muscle length, number of muscles activated, joint displacement, force of the movement, trajectory, direction of the movement, right? So the primary motor cortex is very important for voluntary movement. So now let's see some videos related to the working of the primary motor cortex. So based on our knowledge of the physiology, you can expect that if we want to have a movement like this, right? First, some neurons in the motor cortex should be activated. So we need action potential from these neurons. Then this action potential should go through the corticospinal tract to the spinal cord. Then this signal should reach as the alpha motor neuron, alpha motor neurons should go to this muscle, right? And cause contraction. This movement is called flexion. When we want to do this movement, extension, another neuron should be activated. Action potential should be sent to the spinal cord, alpha motor neuron, extension muscles of the arm, right? So a person is doing an extension and flexion reflex, okay? So you can see the movie here. So we have one neuron here responsible for extension, another neuron here responsible for flexion. The neuron is here actually, in the primary motor cortex, right? So in the primary motor cortex, we put an electrode, we can record action potential. So first, we can record from one neuron responsible for extension. Then we can record from another neuron responsible for flexion. So we are recording from two neurons, right? So we can see that when this hand moves in the direction of extension, we can expect that extension motor neuron should be activated, but flexion motor neurons should be inhibited, right? So another thing that you should remember here is that before the movement, these neurons are active. So this means when there is no movement in our muscle, neurons in the brain are active. Yeah, so they have some level of activity. But when we want to do a movement, then the activity increases, right? So let's see again. Activity, hyperactivity during the extension, right? Hyperactivity happens in the extension neuron. Again, the last time, the resting state during the movement, right? Now, we want to do the same movement against the load. I mean, we need more force for doing this movement. So this neuron, I mean, this one needs to generate more action potential, right? Another thing which is important is that before the movement, we should keep the load, right? To keep the load, we need contraction in the flexor muscle, right? Flexor muscle keeps the load, then extensor muscle actually removes the load or lifts the load, right? So in the resting state, we can expect that flexor muscle should be active, and during the movement, we can expect that extensor muscle neuron should be more active, right? So let's see that. So extensor motor neuron, flexion motor neuron. Now, the flexor motor neurons can keep the load. So they should be activated in the resting state. But just before the movement, we need more activity in the extensor muscles. So flexor muscles, extensor muscle, actually I explain it in the opposite direction, okay? So the load is kept by the extensor muscles, right? So before the movement, extensor muscles are active. So we have hyperexcitability in the neuron. And when we want to move the muscle, we need more activity, okay? So again, extensor motor neuron in the resting state is more active, and then during the movement, it's activated more and more, right? So now we change the position of the load on the flexor muscle. So the load is here. For keeping this load, flexor muscles should be activated in the resting state, right? But for extension, we need to release these neurons, I mean these muscles. The load itself can cause extension, right? Got it? So in the resting state, we should keep the weight. So we need contraction of the flexors. But for extension, we only need to release this flexion because the load itself can cause extension. So the same also happens in the neurons. So flexors are active, then everything is released. So we have less action potentials, fewer action potentials. Got it? So I just wanted to say that you should imagine this. For any movement, everything should start from the cortex. Right? Neurons in the cortex should be activated. They should generate action potential, and this action potential should reach the spinal cord. Right? So this is very simple. So now let's talk about the supplementary motor area.
The main difference between voluntary and involuntary movement is the voluntary movement don't have external stimulus. That means the sensory body is out of it.
No, I mean, for voluntary movement, first we should think about the movement. We should decide about having the movement. Then we need movement selection. Yeah. So it starts from the prefrontal cortex, not mentioned in your material. Then, so I mean, decision making happens here. Then we should have the selection of the movement. This happens in the premotor cortex, right? Then we need performance. I mean, execution of the movement. This happens in the primary motor cortex. Actually, this is the simplest view of the action of the motor cortex, but this is not in reality. Okay, in reality, every part of the motor cortex is involved in all movements. Okay, but we can say that generally, neurons in the premotor cortex are involved in planning of the movement, but neurons in the primary motor cortex are important for execution or performance of the movements. Right? So supplementary motor area. Strong stimulation here may cause contraction again. Right? So, but contraction may be in different forms. Bilateral grasping, like this, right? Complex postural movements, like this, or this, okay? For example, you can imagine that you want to play ping pong and you're ready for receiving the ball and hitting it, right? So when you are ready for that, you keep this position, okay? So this is a complex bodily movement, complex postural movement. So this is controlled by the supplementary motor area. We sometimes call this body-wide attitudinal movement. So this is the same also. Attitudinal movement is like this. So when there is no movement from this place to another place, okay? So this one, or this movement, all of these are called attitudinal body movements or complex postural movements. This area is also important for vocalization. You know that talking is a very complex movement, right? It's done by several muscles, muscles of the lips, muscles of the face, muscles of the tongue, muscles of the throat, muscles of the respiratory system. Okay? So it's a very, very complex movement. And for any complex movement, supplementary motor area is important. So vocalization needs origination of some signals from the supplementary motor cortex toward the primary motor cortex, right? So, fixation movement. For example, you want to draw something, right? And you are drawing, for example. So, movement is happening in the wrist. But what about the shoulder and elbow? It's fixed. I mean, it's not relaxed. You keep your shoulder and elbow fixed, and then you can move your fingers or wrist. So this movement, fixational movement, is controlled by supplementary motor area. But this movement of the wrist, is being controlled by the primary motor cortex. Got it? Okay. Another thing I forgot to mention is that supplementary motor area is important for movement sequence. Sequence means when you have several movements in sequence, right? For example, for turning the radio on, you should stretch out your arm, you should reach the bottom, press it, turn. Okay? So you have reaching movement, pressing movement, turning movement. 3 movements in a row. Right? This sequence is controlled by supplementary motor area. So for any sequence of movement, supplementary motor area is important.
What is the location of this area? The location of this area.
The location, it's located in the Broadman area 6 between the hemispheres. Right? So now let's see a video about the sequential movement. So in this video, you will see that a person is doing some simple movements or simple sequence and some complex sequence of movement. In the first example here, the person do this. Okay? It's a simple movement. I mean, in terms of sequence, there is no sequence here. Okay? In the second part, the person will do a specific sequence of movement, like this one, then this one, then this one, and this one. Okay? So again, okay? And the person is repeating this movement. In the third example here, the person doesn't move the fingers, but imagine that he's doing that in the mind. Okay? So now let's see what happens in the brain. So when there is no sequence of movement, primary motor cortex, supplementary motor cortex on the opposite side is activated. When there is a sequence of movement, the same area is activated, but supplementary motor area on both sides are activated. Right? When the person imagines that he's doing the movement, then only supplementary motor area on both sides of the brain is activated, not the primary motor cortex, primary somatosensory cortex. Again, okay, simple movement involves primary motor and primary somatosensory cortex. Sequence of movement, the same areas plus supplementary motor area. But this happens bilaterally. The person imagines that he's doing the movement. There is no real movement. Supplementary motor area is important. So when you think that you are doing a sequence of movement, your supplementary motor area on both sides of your brain is activated. Right? So when you do this, I don't know the name, tasbih. Okay? It's a simple movement. Right? Somatosensory area, primary. Primary motor cortex is activated. When you have a specific sequence of movement, then both of these areas plus supplementary motor area on both sides are activated. Got it? Why it's important? What? Yeah, I told you before. The connection for supplementary motor area is bilateral. I told you that stimulation here causes bilateral grasping. So when you stimulate one side, it causes movement on both sides. So the connection of the supplementary motor area with the body is bilateral. Okay? Yeah? Not all of the cortex. So for most of the cortex, we have contralateral connection. Right? So primary motor cortex on the right side causes movement on the left side of the body, and vice versa. But for supplementary motor area, this is not the case. Okay? Connection is bilateral because it's located at a higher level. It's mainly involved in thinking processes. And thinking is not unilateral. Okay? So it's at the boundary of movement and thinking. Supplementary motor area. So features here becomes more complex, right? So, are you tired? Yes? But you decided to have lecture, right? So if you want, you can have only 5 minutes rest. Is that okay? Okay, 5 minutes. So it's 9 and I will start at 9